Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's regular meeting of the Portsmouth Planning Board for September 10th, 2009. We have one item on the agenda tonight, which is a public hearing. I'll read in the notice. The public hearing is convened to solicit public comment on the draft revised zoning ordinance dated June 11, 2009, and the draft revised site plan review regulations dated April 24th, 2008. Copies of these documents are available for public inspection in the Planning Department, the Public Library, and on the city's website, which is www.cityofportsmouth.com. Reading that in, I'll now turn it over to Rick Tainter.
Okay, and I will begin with a presentation at the podium and then come back here for the question and comment section. And so this is, again, an opportunity for public comment on the draft revised zoning ordinance and the draft revised site plan review regulations. I'm going to do a quick overview of some of the major changes in the ordinance. I'm not trying to cover everything that has been changed, but just to give an overview of some of the major points, and then we will have the opportunity for questions and comments and so forth. And the scope of what we've been doing is actually affected four different areas. The major piece, and the piece that we've been working on for really 3 years now, has been the comprehensive revision of the zoning ordinance. And that has been really taking the existing ordinance apart and restructuring it, putting it back together, looking at the district regulations, the uses that are allowed in each zoning district. The Planning Board has gone over those probably 2 complete times, item by item and line by line. So the use table has been very carefully looked at. The dimensional regulations as well. We've looked at the environmental protection standards and provisions, particularly inland wetlands and tidal wetlands protection. Yeah. We've reviewed, and we did that with the assistance of the Conservation Commission. We looked at the historic preservation standards and processes with the Historic District Commission. We looked at site development regulations and parking regulations. Parking, unloading, and signage were really 3 major parts of that. And then we major part of it, even though it may not be substantive, is looking at the format and the structure of the ordinance and looking at terms, what terms mean, being very careful about defining terms so that there's much less ambiguity. The second part of 2008, but because there's such an interrelationship between the zoning regulations and the site plan regulations, the Planning Board has deferred adoption or deferred action on the site plan review regulations until the City Council has adopted the zoning ordinance. The third part of this is the zoning map, and there are some small changes to boundary changes to existing districts, particularly the Central Business District down along Islington Street. And there are some new districts. We have a new gateway district, which I'll talk about later on in the presentation, and we've established some sign districts so that the signs have different districts than the use districts. And the final piece, which needs to be addressed, are some other city ordinances. There are ordinances that address the responsibilities of the Planning Board, and because we're taking some things out of the zoning ordinance, they need to go into the general city ordinance. The site plan review ordinance, the ordinance where the city adopts the state site plan review authorization and applies it in the city, has to be changed because we're proposing a reduction in terms of the area or an expansion of the types of uses that are covered by site plan review. Currently, the site plan review is only applied to 5 or more residential, in the residential case, only applied to structures with 5 or more dwelling units. And we're proposing to use the state authorized standard of 3 or more dwelling units. And there are some performance standards such as noise and light and so forth that need also to be looked at in the city ordinances. Some major changes, as I mentioned, format and structure of the ordinance is important. Right now there are several separate tables of use regulations, and we've consolidated those into one table so that we can look at a use as it applies across all the districts in the city, and we've gone through and carefully updated it. We've, again, combined the dimensional standards in one section of the ordinance. They were spread out also. There are several overlay districts in the city, the historic district, floodplain district. There's an Osprey Landing district that relates to housing, and the downtown overlay district. We've put all those in one section of the ordinance. We've grouped all the supplemental use regulations, supplemental regulations that are specific to one type of use in one section, and tried to distinguish those from the general use regulations. So all of these types of things are meant to make the ordinance easier to use and easier to navigate and just more logical format. And then, as I mentioned, we've done a lot with the definitions and expanded those. Some substantive changes. As I mentioned earlier, we're proposing a gateway district, and within that, a gateway plan development, and that will be explained a little bit further on. But it's a way to try to encourage enhancing development or improve development along business corridors. And our initial proposal is to apply it to Lafayette Road. And in previous public hearings, we've heard suggestions that it be applied other places too, such as the traffic circle area and the Route 1 bypass and Woodbury Avenue. The continuing care retirement community is a section of the ordinance that has received a lot of attention and a lot of comment at previous previous public hearings. That was something that came. It was a request to the City Council, and the City Council referred it to the Planning Board, and we worked on this in parallel with the overall zoning ordinance revision. And then a couple of months ago, I believe in July, the Planning Board folded it into the overall revised zoning ordinance. In terms of wetlands, we've changed the jurisdictional area of wetlands. Currently, an area is only considered jurisdictional wetlands. Our wetlands regulations only apply to it if it is at least half an acre, and we have proposed reducing that to 10,000 square feet, so it does add some coverage. And we've added performance standards regarding stormwater management and vegetation management in wetlands buffer areas. We're proposing some changes to downtown parking standards and options in the downtown, and as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at sign districts. The Gateway District is probably the one that is the most the largest change in terms of the commercial development areas. We're looking at this area on the map on the right. You can see some landmarks, Yokins near the top, Market Basket, Water Country, Southgate Plaza, Walmart. But basically, we're proposing to rezone the entire area from the Rye Town line to the Route 1 bypass from either general business or office research to this new gateway district. And the purpose of this is to encourage a higher quality of development, to improve the character of the development, to make it a more attractive area, to encourage some mixing of uses. Right now, in those districts, residential is not permitted, and we're trying to use the selective allowance of residential development as part of a mixed-use development as a way to encourage a redevelopment at a higher quality. And that would help, we hope, encourage or expand moderate-cost housing opportunities. We also have standards in the Gateway District to incorporate pedestrian and bicycle access and circulation, and to use the concept is by having a more intensive and appropriate type of redevelopment of existing commercial areas, we use our existing infrastructure more efficiently. And just to give you an example of what we're thinking about, this is a visualization from another community. This is Glenview, Illinois, but it gives you the kind of sense of the kinds of things that can happen with appropriate zoning combined with private investment. None of this happens without private investment, but this is the kind of commercial strip that is not too different from some parts of Lafayette Road, and there are public investments that can happen. They include pavement improvements, sidewalk improvements, landscaping, trees, and so forth. But if the appropriate zoning comes into play, over time, areas can get redeveloped at a higher density. So we're going from a very low density with lots of pavement and primarily single-story buildings, and over time, perhaps encouraging 2- and 3-story buildings, and particularly with buildings closer to the street. So it's much more of the kind of atmosphere that you have in the older parts of the city. It's never going to turn into the downtown of Portsmouth, but it could be something that's a little bit improved and offers more opportunities for a stronger tax base and more residential and commercial opportunities. And one example that is frequently looked at in New England of this type of thing is a place called Mashpee Commons on Cape Cod, which is an old shopping center. You can see the black and white photograph of the old shopping center, and it was redeveloped on site with a higher density, going from 1-story to 2- and 3-story buildings, a variety of office as well as retail uses, and they're starting to add some residential uses, and just trying to make it more pedestrian friendly. So the photograph on the color photograph down below with the on-street parking and street trees and sidewalks is in what used to be a typical suburban shopping center parking lot. In terms of what we're proposing for the Gateway District, we're basing the underlying zoning on the existing general business district, which is what most of Lafayette Road is now, and we're reducing the minimum front yard. Right now there's a special regulation that applies on Lafayette Road that's a 105-foot setback from the edge of the road, and that was done to accommodate future widening of the road, and we've spoken with the State Department of Transportation, and based on those conversations, we have reduced the setback requirements to accommodate a 92-foot wide right-of-way on Lafayette Road. So we're really talking something, if we think about 20 feet back from that area, we're reducing it from a 105-foot setback down to a 20 or 30 or 40-foot setback. So it really opens up some possibilities for redeveloping. And we're also proposing a maximum front yard in addition to a minimum front yard, and requiring the parking to be behind the front of the building so that you don't have the building at the way at the back as you do in some of the typical suburban type of development that's out there. Then in addition to those allowed uses, we're proposing this new use called a gateway plan development that would be allowed by a conditional use permit from the planning board. It's an optional use, it's not required, but some of the characteristics are that if residential were included, or even if it weren't included, if you followed the standards of this conditional use with architectural standards, pedestrian-oriented development, and so forth, there's a possibility for a further reduction in the front yards, greater coverage, much more flexibility. So the idea is to try to encourage some mixing of uses and a little bit more intensive development as long as it is environmentally friendly and aesthetically pleasing. The downtown parking system has been in place for 12 years, and it was adopted to promote shared parking in garages, to discourage individual parking lots and parking garages at street level, to really maintain the vibrancy of the streetscape with stores right along the front of the lot and no breaks in the streetscape. And it worked well for quite a while, but after more than a decade, it's become very difficult to administer. It's increasingly complex because we always have to look back to a 1997 number, and sometimes that 1997 number has to be recomputed from scratch. It's very difficult to understand, and in many cases it seems inequitable because similar uses could have totally different parking requirements depending upon whether they existed back in 1997 or they're coming into the downtown now. So some changes have been discussed for many years. The Economic Development Commission has been involved in a lot of those discussions, and we've come up with a proposal that we think will begin to address some of those issues. And it's really three parts. We're modifying the actual parking requirements to better reflect the actual demands in a downtown area, because in a downtown area people park and then you do multiple things rather than parking, going to a store, driving to another store, et cetera. So there are different types of parking requirements. And also there are public garages, public on-street spaces, public parking lots. So there are many more options than just a private parking lot. We want to update the in lieu fee. In the downtown right now, there's an option where a developer can essentially pay a fee instead of providing the parking space. And as it has turned out over the years, that fee has been a very small fraction of the actual cost of providing parking. So even though the fee has been paid, the city has not had the ability to use those fees to create equivalent parking spaces. And we want to simplify the calculation of that fee as well. So in terms of modifying parking requirements, one thing that we want to do is to eliminate all parking requirements for first floor uses other than restaurants, because those are the uses that really drive the pedestrian vibrancy of the downtown. So as a very first step, all of those first floor retail, first floor office type uses would not have parking requirements. We want to standardize the upper floor parking requirements based on floor area. Right now there's a bias toward residential development, and we want to just make it all equal so use isn't chosen on the basis of how much parking they have to provide, but on the basis of what the appropriate use is. And then in order to support smaller uses, we're proposing that the first 4 parking spaces that result from the computation be essentially waived, so that if a small business comes in, if you've got a small property and it only requires 2 parking spaces, would only require 2 parking spaces under the formula, we wouldn't require any parking spaces at all. The idea is to really support those small businesses. So we're hoping that this will reduce the overall parking requirements in the downtown, and then at the same time we'll be proposing some increases in fees. One thing we want to do is require on-site for residential uses, on-site parking, not to allow that to be bought out. And the reason for that is that those are the people who, when there's a snow emergency and they don't have a place to park, or just coming downtown and trying to get home and not having a place to park near their home, those are the people who we are concerned about, and they don't have any other options, such as going to a parking garage for the day. Or if they do, it's a difficult thing to do at night in the winter. The second part is to increase the fee so that we eventually aim toward the private contribution being 40 to 50% of the cost of providing a public space space in a parking garage. And then the final thing is to eliminate that 1997 look-back provision where we have to go back and compute what the parking requirement was in 1997, and basically treat everybody the same and not discriminate based on what the use was back in 1997. I mentioned that the continuing care retirement community has been a major topic of development, of discussion. It originated as a rezoning request to the City Council to allow senior housing or congregate housing in the Office Research District under certain situations, and it was referred to the Planning Board by the City Council as happens with all rezoning requests. And the Planning Board has been working for over a year, sometimes on its own, sometimes in discussions with the proponent with the proponent to come up with an ordinance that would make sense for the city. So it started out being developed in parallel with the overall zoning ordinance revision process, and then in July they got merged. So what this includes is defining a new use in the zoning ordinance, defining a continuing care retirement community as being something that includes 3 types of units: independent living, assisted living, and skilled nursing care, and so that you have that continuum of care going from when you can live on your own as if in a regular apartment, and then go into assisted living and go into skilled nursing. But it includes other components such as common dining areas and supportive services and so forth. It would require a conditional use permit, and it has to contain all 3 types of uses. In terms of the site requirements that we are looking at for this, it has to be in the Office Research District, has to be within a half mile of a hospital, and it has to be at least 35 acres on 1 or more lots. And on this map, what I'm showing is the inner ring is the half-mile radius. The light yellow areas and the pink for the hospital are the Office Research District. And so those are all the parcels that could be combined. I've lost the thing here. All the parcels that could be combined to make up a 35-acre tract. And the area dotted in red to the lower right of the hospital is the proposed tract that started the whole thing off. We have density requirements, a certain amount of land area required for each type of dwelling unit. There are setbacks specified. 50 would have to be at least 40% of the developable area. That's the area excluding wetlands and steep slopes and so forth. And any areas that are within 100 feet of a residential district have to be residential buffer area. And then there are building height requirements. And the idea here is that it would be a step-back type of approach where if you're less than 150 feet from a residential district, you'd be limited to 3 stories, which is very close to the 35-foot height limit, or 30-foot height limit in the residential areas. And then if you're more than 150 feet, you could go up to 4 stories or 50 feet high. And these are not proposed buildings for that area. These are just examples of assisted living facilities or senior housing facilities that are of the type that we're talking about, or that are being proposed. In terms of resource protection and sustainability, as I mentioned, we're reducing the jurisdictional size of jurisdictional wetlands from half an acre to 10,000 square feet, and we're also including vernal pools. And it may be difficult to see on this map, but the shading that is most of the map, or a good portion of the map, especially the lower, the southwest, is the existing area that is either wetlands or wetland buffer areas, and the blue spots are the additional the areas that are small wetlands that are outside those buffer areas. So those are the additional areas that would be covered by the change in wetland regulations. And the vernal pools are red dots, and there are only 4 or 5 of them. There are a couple in the far east corner and a couple others spread throughout. So these are important in terms of resource protection, but they're not extensive in terms of areas of the city that they would affect. We're also looking at encompassing all of North Mill Pond and South Mill Pond essentially as tidal wetlands. Portions of them are covered now, but not all of them. We're requiring stormwater best management practices to protect water quality going into wetlands, and we're proposing vegetation management practices within the buffer area. In terms of sign regulations, the existing sign regulations, as most do, address the types of signs you're allowed to have, whether they're flush against the wall or projecting out, as you see in this photograph, or freestanding signs or monument signs. So those are addressed, the area of each type of sign and absolute or aggregate area for a particular property or business, height of signs and setback from property lines, and the types of illumination that you're allowed to have. And these issues apply very differently in different parts of the city. So what we're proposing to do is develop up to six sign districts, which at this point are combinations of different use districts, but they can serve as a basis to go a little bit further in the future and become more precise. But they're designed to help us focus in on the types of sign issues that are appropriate to each district. And then the zoning map is another area that we're looking at, and there are a limited number of zoning changes that we're proposing right now. One is the area along Islington Street. So, is this on?
Not yet.
Maybe I can't do that.
Maybe it was on before.
You had it on.
Is that on?
Push and hold.
Push and hold. Like that? That's good? Okay. So right now on Islington Street.
No, you're not on.
Not on. Okay.
Sorry. He's coming.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, but usually it works. It's just that it's so confusing.
Okay. Oh, it's on, yep.
Okay.
Just going to speak into it. Okay, so this is Islington Street coming down here, and the dark red is the Central Business B District, and as you can see, there's a long strip of Central Business B coming down Islington Street. That's an area of a 60-foot height limit next to a residential area with a 30-foot height limit or 35-foot height limit, and it really is, it's only one lot deep, and because of some of the other aspects of the Central Business District and the types of uses that are allowed, it was felt that that was an area that really needed to be addressed. So what we're proposing to do is extend the mixed residential business district, which comes up here, and bring it all the way up to just before the Klein's building, so that that area would be have a 45-foot, I believe, height limit, and would have a different set of uses allowed. So it would be more consistent along the whole zoning district, the whole corridor. Then with the historic district, there are a number of changes that are being proposed. One is to extend the historic district. Right now it comes down Islington Street to Dover Street and Union Street, and to extend it down to Bartlett Street and Jewel, to include that area as an extension. A second part of it is to extend it from right now the intersection of Lafayette Road and Middle Street, to bring it down Lafayette Road to the intersection of South Street, and this is the Lafayette School down here. So that's another piece to address. And these districts really are meant to control or to manage change along the major corridors coming into the downtown. The third piece is a very small but important section of the a few lots on at the corner of Maplewood and Vaughan Mall and Hanover Street. Thank you very much. And finally, I could have read it off the chart. And finally, there are some adjustments along Middle Street. In many in these districts, the historic district is defined by lot lines, but along Middle Street, it's been defined as a consistent distance back from the street. And so what is being proposed is to follow the example used elsewhere, so that these green areas along the edges of the district would be taken out of the historic district, and these pink areas, which are the lots that front on Middle Street, would be added back in. So that's the kind of change that's being proposed there. In terms of Osprey Landing, this is an area that was redeveloped, and it had some zoning in place to allow for its redevelopment, and it's called the Office Research Mariners Village District, but it's a variety of things. It includes office research uses along Portsmouth Boulevard, and then various types of residential uses in the other part of the easterly part of it. And that whole area has been redeveloped essentially, and so what we're proposing to do is to rezone this area to the use for which it really is appropriate based on the uses that have been developed. So the westerly part of it would be rezoned to office research. The central part would be rezoned to general residence B. The far east along Spinnaker would be zoned to garden apartment. And then there would be an overlay district right in the middle, a smaller overlay district that only addresses the portions of the zoning that still apply that have to do with affordability and whether the housing is renter or owner occupied. And then we're looking at other zoning map changes too. One of the things that is being it's another referral from the City Council, but this is an area of land between the Route 1 bypass, Kate Street, Cottage Street. This is Islington Street, or I'm sorry, Bartlett Street. Cottage Street is over here, Islington Street here. So it's an area that is currently zoned industrial. It's been requested to be rezoned to general business, and one of the thoughts is that it could provide a new connection from the bypass to Bartlett Street and take some of the pressure off Cottage Street and some other streets in the area. So we're reviewing that right now. That hasn't been, we don't have a final proposal for that at this point. And there are other individual rezoning requests that have come in over the past few years that we're also going to be reviewing. And in the future, we'll be looking at some non-conforming, some neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly non-conforming, and trying to come up with new standards for those neighborhoods. The coloring on these maps, these are a couple of examples. This is Elwyn Park, and this is Ocean Road and Maple Haven, this area here on Lafayette. And so these maps show by how much the lots in the neighborhood are below the requirements for the existing requirements for the zoning. And so if you have something this would be 50 to 75% of the required lot size, this could be less than 25% of the required lot size. So we're going to be looking at those areas and trying to develop standards on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis that's really more appropriate to the neighborhoods, so that people aren't being forced to go to the Board of Adjustment for variances just to be like the character of their neighborhood. But that won't happen in this round. That'll probably happen in the next year. So in terms of the process of moving forward, the City Council has to adopt the zoning ordinance. It's their responsibility. And their responsibility also to amend other ordinances, such as the Planning Board ordinance, which deals with the portion that we're concerned about is the the City Council referral process, which is right now is embedded in the zoning ordinance and really should be in the Planning Board ordinance. And to amend the Site Plan Review ordinance to incorporate 3-unit and 4-unit dwellings as part of that. And then the Planning Board would adopt the Site Plan Review regulations. The draft regulations are on the city's website. If you go to you don't have to actually look at this full URL. You can go to the main city webpage, and there's a link there under what's new to the land use regulation revision process, and there's a whole number of documents there, and also a place where you can submit comments online. This is our last public hearing on a series of 4 public hearings, so the planning board in a couple of weeks will start reviewing the comments and deciding on what changes should be made, and we're hoping to recommend the ordinance to the City Council by October 13th. And then from there on, it's the City Council's process to review and take action on it. They will have their public hearing process, and then we hope adopt the ordinance with or without changes. We've received a number of comments. Over the first 3 public hearings, we've received comments in the mail and by email and by phone call, all sorts of comments. Just some of the ones, this is not all of them, but some of them, we'll definitely be taking a look at all of them very carefully. Some of them we've already decided, yes, they make sense. One of them is to just include a statement of what the purpose of each zoning district is, because that's never anywhere in the zoning ordinance, and it really should be there as a guide to people who aren't familiar with the ordinance. There's been a comment about the apartment district along Islington Street and the traffic congestion that the large number of dwelling units with maybe unrelated individuals creates a parking congestion, traffic congestion, and a suggestion to look at other areas of the city for that. As I mentioned earlier, there's been suggestions to expand the Gateway District to other areas of the city. There's been suggestions to allow existing residents in the Waterfront Business District to expand. They're not allowed uses right now. There have been suggestions to allow neighborhood businesses in some right now, but they predate zoning. There's been a suggestion to encourage more compact residential development to use land more efficiently. With respect to the continuing care retirement community, there have been suggestions to remove all the restrictions on site area and location so that it can be used in other parts of the city. And I do note here that the original proposal from Borthwick Village was, instead of a 35-acre minimum, it was a 5-acre minimum. Instead of a half mile from the hospital, it was a 1 mile. The planning board was really trying to be more conservative in developing the ordinance, and that maybe it could be looked at somewhat differently. Been concerned about the access, or in particular the case of Borthwick Village, the potential impact on Islington Street. We made some changes in the regulations regarding motor vehicle sales, which had some unintended consequences, and we had comments on that both in person and in a public hearing, and to leave the existing standards in place, and we believe that that's probably the appropriate thing to do. A suggestion that we repeal all local wetlands regulations and use the state regulations instead. We had suggestions about how to better define signs, and it was a suggestion to prohibit all internal illumination of signs. So there's been a wide variety of things that have been looked at, and we will continue to look at them. Your comments tonight and anything that you want to do by mail, phone, email, or using the online contact site will be heard. So that's the end of that presentation.
Thank you, Rick. Just to touch on a few points that Rick brought up is that we are making a list of comments that we've received online as well as in the public hearing sessions. Just to reiterate what Rick touched upon, we will have a meeting on September 24th to review comments that were sent via online suggestions or at the public hearings, and it's our intention on October 8th to vote on the final draft. So that'll be the process. We still do have a public hearing session tonight, and Rick, thank you for posting those comments that we've received to date. So with that, I'll now open up the public hearing. If anybody would like to speak to, for, or against what you've seen here, if we could just get your name and address for the record, please.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Charlie Griffin. I live at 210 Hillside Drive in Portsmouth. I have some comments and just some questions. I've gone through the ordinance twice. On section 10.22220 on page 4 talks about the requirement to have a certificate of occupancy, among other things, where buildings are altered. And my question is, what's the difference between altering a building and remodeling a building? And could this section be interpreted to mean, for example, if someone remodels a kitchen or puts in a new bathroom, that's considered altering the building and a certificate of occupancy would be required under those circumstances. My understanding has been that certificate of occupancies are customarily required when you've obviously got new construction or if you're converting a building from one type to another. And I just asked you to give some thought to that. Also on page 5, section 232.20 sets forth the specific standards for special exception, and that's in the current ordinance. But on page 6, section 10.233.10, which talks about variance standards, simply says you have to meet all the criteria for variances described in state law. And I believe it would be better to include the specific criteria or standards for variances, as is the case in the present ordinance, rather than just having a general reference to state law. You know, people such as myself who are in the legal profession, obviously we can go to state law and find those standards. But someone who is not and is looking at the ordinance and thinks they need a variance and is told you need to go to state law to find out what the requirements are, I don't think that's particularly consumer friendly or user friendly. And I would suggest that the existing language in the ordinance, which outlines what those standards are, be included in this ordinance. Section 2.23420 on page 6, appeals from decisions of the code official, doesn't indicate any time frame in which that appeal must be filed. And having had some personal experience with this last year, I would suggest that the ordinance needs to include a phrase, either a reasonable time after the decision becomes known or in accordance with state law, which talks about a reasonable time. But there needs to be some time frame referenced in which you can take an appeal from a decision of the code official. Section 10.234.40 on page 7 talks about giving notices of public hearings for Board of Adjustment matters. And it says that the notice requirements will be in accordance with the provisions of state law, but then goes on to say that all persons owning property within 300 feet of the property involved will be given those notices. But state law only requires that abutters be notified, and abutters are more narrowly defined as someone whose property is located in New Hampshire and adjoins or is directly across the street or stream from the land under consideration. And also, there's an inconsistency between the notice requirements for Board of Adjustment matter and the notice requirements for a site review matter. On page 11, paragraph 3A of the proposed site review regulations, the notice for site plan review is limited to direct abutters in accordance with state law, and that is indeed what's in the current site review regulations. But it seems to me if the zoning ordinance expands the class of people who are entitled to receive notice of a ZBA proceeding beyond what the state law requires, then the same requirement should apply to the class of people who receive notices of site review proceedings, because frequently obtaining a variance is a prerequisite before going to site review. And it seems to me if you're entitled to notice that a piece of property in your area is going to be the subject of a variance because you're within 300 feet, for example, then you should also similarly be entitled to the same type of notice when that proposal goes forward to site review. It just seems to be more consistent. The next one I had has already been addressed, a suggestion that there be a statement of overall purpose and intent for each of the districts. Just a very minor point, on page 46, I think there may be a typographical error in section 10.514.22, talks about a plat that is referenced in paragraph 10.51321. And I think that reference should be to section 10.51421, as there is, I don't think there is any section 10.51321 in the ordinance. Next one, page 47, section 10.51520, required open space. Maybe it's because I'm not an engineer, but I find that whole paragraph very confusing and hard to figure out. But having read it 2 or 3 times, I think I get the sense of it. But The first paragraph says calculations of open space shall not include any area with a horizontal dimension that is less than 5 feet, unless perimeter of the open space connecting the endpoints of the 5-foot dimension line is less than 15 feet. That's confusing, but I think it can be figured out. However, the illustrations that are shown use an actual 5-foot dimension and not a dimension that is less than 5 feet. And so I would suggest that perhaps with the introductory paragraph, which reads less than 5 feet, in light of the examples, maybe should simply be tweaked to say 5 feet or less, because you've got illustrations at 5 feet, which is not consistent with less than 5 feet. Also, section 10.51610 talks about calculating exceptions to the front yard setbacks. And, you know, if the principal buildings on the street, on the same side of the street, seem to have less than the existing setbacks. That sounds good in theory. My question is, how does someone actually make those calculations? What data, what documentation is the department going to want to establish that? Will it be sufficient, for example, to take a look at the assessor's maps and scale off of that, or will something more detailed be required? Page 154, section 10.1140, outdoor lighting. First of all, there's no definition of outdoor lighting, and I would ask you to consider whether, in fact, there should be a definition of outdoor lighting. In that same section, section 10.1141 says the purpose of the section is to minimize light trespass. But then on page 156, in section 10.114420, says the purpose is to eliminate light trespass on abutting residential properties. I feel the language should be consistent and the standard should be to eliminate and not to minimize light trespass and glare. Also, there is a conflict between section 10.1144.20 on page 156, which talks about abutting residential lots, and section 10.1144.50 on the same page, which refers to buildings on adjacent or nearby land. And I think that language needs to be made consistent. Some definition of the word abutting, I think, should be included. And it may be to include properties that are across the street or highway, because otherwise, if it's left as is, the situation that occurred recently with a case will not be resolved by this change of language. I think the term abutting needs to be defined broadly enough to include adjoining, either across the street or highway, from or nearby to, in order to afford residential property owners the greatest possible degree of protection. While section 10.1514 on page 185 says when terms are not defined in any of the ordinance or the building code, they'll have their ordinarily accepted meanings. In this particular case, the word abutting in several dictionaries means to touch or end at one end or side. And obviously, as we've recently learned, that's not good enough to protect certain residential properties. So I think a definition of abutting needs to be closely looked at and made flexible enough to make sure that if you have a residential property that doesn't touch up against a non-residential piece of property, you know, you're still considered to be abutting for the purposes of the protection of the ordinance. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, can I just ask if you have those notes written down? I was writing as fast as I could,
Sure.
but
I'll email them to you in the morning.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. First-time speakers, if we could just get your name and address, please.
Good evening, I'm Pat Gormley, and I live at 579 Sagamore Avenue. First of all, I'd like to compliment the planning board and staff on the extent of the work that's been done. I think it's very impressive with what little I know about what you're doing. It's terrific. I wanted to address two things, one very specifically and one generally. In Article 10, the environmental protection standards, on page 129, The buffer is discussed as under 10.1014.22, 100 feet of the jurisdictional area. And I know that this is a very helpful kind of setback, and the state pretty much is leaving it to the cities and other municipalities to work out the best way to do this. However, particularly with vernal pools, it seems that we have very few of them, or at least very few that are identified, and they are very fragile, even more than the wetlands. And it seems that it would make sense to give them at least a larger setback in this regard. It would be nice to have it for wetlands as well, just generally, but it seems that 200 feet would make sense in that regard. I looked through the RSAs, and I don't practice law in New Hampshire, so I'm sure that there may have been some that I missed, but one of the few mentions of a setback for vernal pools and other wetlands and certain bodies of water included one in RSA 215-A43-2Q, which talks about ATV trails, and they cannot be within 200 feet of these bodies of water, wetlands, and vernal pools, and for a very good reason. But if we need that kind of protection from ATV trails, and granted they're probably the noise from that is more than we might have from any other encroachment upon vernal pools and wetlands. On the other hand, any kind of construction would certainly, even at 100 feet, be not, I don't think, adequate protection. So I'd ask you to consider that, particularly for vernal pools. In terms of generally the way the ordinance changes have been made, the zoning ordinance, I think it's clear that you're encouraging urban density properly, and I think that this is the kind of thing where the clustering and having density and the use of existing footprints is very important in terms of a good urban balance that we have here, with open space then being made available as those kinds of things are being done. I think this has been given a good example by the city recently, specifically with the Portsmouth Middle School, with the school board using an existing site rather than using land either on the high school campus or adjoining Sagamore Creek, and within the framework of the master plan. And so I think that this has been something that we can look to in terms of other kinds of work that's being done, private sector applications. One small thing I would note, and it was very interesting to see the comparisons to in commercial areas and borrowing from the ideas of other folks that have done that and changing it from huge setbacks from the roadway and bringing it in closer and making it essentially a more attractive and lively area. I would be careful about bringing buildings too close to the sidewalk. Obviously that looked more suburban, so that's not happening. But I think one of the problems in a small city is having buildings too close to the sidewalk. And it's one thing if they're that way historically, and that's part of the charm. On the other hand, where you have areas such as the Market Square where you do have setbacks, I think of popovers or in front of the North Church where you have fountains and room for structures for bus stops and things like that. So you have a little bit of urban people room there. And that isn't true on many of the other streets, and sometimes, as I said, it can't be helped, particularly with historic properties. But I think we've lost opportunities to make that kind of space. 100 Market Street springs to mind, where basically you've crowded the sidewalk and not allowed room for things like trees, for benches, for perhaps a future sidewalk cafe or things like that, that again lend part as much of the charm and the commerce of these city streets as the actual stores and buildings themselves. So I would ask that that's something that as the ordinance is finished and administered to be thinking in those terms. And I've spent a lot of time in Portland, which has been rebuilt much later than Portsmouth because of the Victorian era fire, so they have wider sidewalks. But I noticed that over the last couple of years, for example, they've put in a lot of trees, and it just makes a tremendous difference in a very rather than spreading out is a wonderful thing. And again, thank you very much for your work on this,
Thank you, Pat.
this ordinance.
First-time speakers that would like to speak to, for, or against? I'll call.
Good evening. Good evening, yourself tonight. I'll only take a minute of your time. I want to state again that we are very concerned about the section 10.734.53 in the continuing care retirement community provision that requires two separate paths of travel. As I pointed out to you in the last meeting, there are dozens of developments or sections of this community that only have one entrance and one and have a single entrance, others that have one and an emergency entrance, and to be this rigid could actually do the city out of a good project if a project that was proposed could not come up with two legitimate entrances. You haven't left yourself any wiggle room. That point, life in a residential neighborhood. It creates conflict. Boarding house is defined in this document is a resident that rents more than 3 rooms. I think you need to consider that there are residents in this city that don't accommodate. And my final point is, I still find it odd that you describes what you have defined as a boarding house as a rooming house, which leaves the question, how does someone apply to build or have a boarding house in Portsmouth if you've defined a boarding house in what everyone else defines as a rooming house?
Thank you. First-time speaker.
My name is Stephen McHenry. I am Vice Chair of Art Speak, Portsmouth's Cultural Commission. I'm here to talk about the issue of artist live workspace and to encourage you to include this type of dwelling as one of the permitted uses in your zoning charts, definitions, and dimensional tables. In discussing this issue, it's important to take into account that in Portsmouth's master plan, there are numerous references to the need to encourage artists' space, artists' housing, affordable housing for creative economy members. I won't go through in the highlighted areas of the master plan that refer to this, but they're in the housing sections, in the economic development sections, and several other sections actually. But all of them talk about evaluating and encouraging the use of this type of housing and this type and how important it is to the livelihood, diversity, interest for the community. As a result, if you try, fortunately, after a meeting we had with Rick Hopley on this issue, he pointed out that in the 2009 IBC, International Building Code, which is now our state building code, the 2009 edition has a change which includes in section 419 a very clear and concise definition of live-work units. It would appear that inevitably you will adopt this new 2009 version, and usually there's a lag time between its publication and the adoption by any municipality. But I'd like to read very quickly what they consider this to be. A live-work unit is a dwelling unit or sleeping unit in which a significant portion of the space includes a non-residential use that is operated by the tenant and shall comply with sections, so on. The limitations are the following. The live-work unit is permitted to be a maximum of 3,000 square feet. The non-residential area is permitted to be a maximum of 50% of the area of each live-work unit. The non-residential area function shall be limited to the first or main floor of the live-work unit. So there, in pretty clear terms, is a definition of live-work space. I think it's going to be an issue that's supported and adopted by many other states and communities, and soon to be Portsmouth. So as a result, we would ask the question how it applies to the current zoning ordinance. And I think the general question is, this kind of housing and where it might be most appropriate in the city is obviously up to the zoning map itself and to your own discretion. But I think it asks the question about what the density of this kind of housing offers to the city. It also leads to the point about sustainable communities. As a LEED certified professional, we are always studying ways to create more sustainable communities. That's more than simply certain environmental standards, but good urban planning standards as well, which is exactly what we're talking about here tonight. But density in these communities really creates greater diversity in housing types. It allows for transportation, public transportation options and alternatives that don't now exist. This kind of density helps create green space and a sense of community. And in fact, this kind of development requires less infrastructure cost on a per unit basis because of its density. So specifically in terms of what we would recommend in Portsmouth, or at least personally would recommend, is that we make some changes to the dimensional standards. If you go to the existing dimensional standards table in our current zoning ordinance, and we look at the one that is being proposed in the draft June ordinance, June of this year ordinance, in areas that are now called the areas around the central business district, the MRO zone, A zone, MRB zones, the recommendation would be to make these lot coverage and lot area per dwelling and setbacks denser than they are now. Also, I don't know if this has been suggested before, but the office research zone, which is located along the railroad tracks and near the mill pond, is really, I think, inappropriate and probably should simply be changed to a different designation. And if you look at those areas that are directly abutting the central business zones that I described, there are very few that meet the current standards for development. That is, there, as you showed in your graphic earlier, there's a high percentage of those lots and building footprints that are anywhere near compliant. And the net result of that is zoning by variance, which is a long and tedious process. I'd like to introduce Jane James as well as Carla Goodnight, who would also like to address a couple of other issues regarding this issue of artist live workspace and how appropriate it can be for the city.
Good evening. My name is Jane James, and I'm here as the chair of ArtSpeak and also a long-term member of the Space Committee for ArtSpeak, and we've dealt with the live workspace and talked about it for a number of years. 5 or 6 years ago, we took our direction from the master plan, or I think even 5 or 6 years ago it might have been the proposed master plan. Even a few live work units interspersed with other residential units are more than we have now. Our research shows, though Steve made a comment about building code is being typically about up to 3,000 square feet. Our research has shown that they would be generally at about 1,000 square feet. It's our belief that with the term incorporated in the ordinance, potential developers that you deem to be appropriate, the gateway districts would be terrific, such as above single-story buildings, although we can't add on to those buildings now, but in time to come, there could, when somebody's looking to build a market basket or whatever, they could be looking at doing space above that. Plus, they are on the transportation corridors. We're willing at ArtSpeak to work with the planning board and an applicant to explain what the end user is looking for. Frequently, the end user for live workspace is looking for something that's very sparse on the interior, which is not what you're addressing. But we're glad to work with any potential developers or applicants who might be looking to do that sort of thing. We've also done, at the request of the manager several years ago, have an entire qualification for artists to use this space, so that should spaces be sold, we're not talking about that necessarily, but instead of being rented, the artist would have to be their art. This is done in other parts of the country, and if somebody wants to market things on an affordable basis, that's one way of doing it, and we have all those statistics and are glad to work with somebody potentially to do that. This is something we're working towards making more affordable space or moderate housing opportunities for the creative economy. Let them work, live, and prosper in Portsmouth, as well as contribute to our economy. Thank you for your consideration, and thanks for your hard work. I know this has been tough. Thank you.
Jane.
Thanks.
Good evening. I'm Carla Goodnight from CJ Architects, and here tonight as a member of the Artist Live Workspace Committee also. And personally, my interest is to promote the integration of artists into the fabric of our city. And professionally, I would like to be able to offer some specific direction or concrete answers to clients and developers and people who are expressing an interest to me in developing these kinds of spaces, but not knowing really where to begin or what the requirements are or what their the end result will be. To that end, I have a letter here from Eric Chinberg of Chinberg Builders, who agreed to speak to this topic as he has experience with this type of housing. And what he has to say is, at Chinberg Builders, we found Artist Live Workspace contributes a great deal to the diversity of our projects, is attractive to the community, and appeals to our buyers. It is our experience that there is a viable market for this housing type, and we have had some experience with communities and their willingness to support the development of Artist Live Workspace. At our mill conversion project in Somersworth, we found the town very receptive to our proposal. However, there were no guidelines to speak of for this use. We created units that were of the bricks and beams, and the live work units are mixed in with standard apartments and on the same floor as some of the commercial tenants. And we are currently working on approvals for a similar project in Newmarket that will also incorporate live workspaces into a mix of standard residential apartments, office users, and artists. Newmarket's zoning provides incentive for live workspace by considering 40% of the square footage of these units toward meeting the minimum requirements for non-residential space. The creation of formal zoning and definitions specifically recognizing Artist Live Workspaces would enhance our ability and also inspire others to develop these spaces and provide affordable housing alternatives for the artist community. I have reviewed the IBC language being considered in Portsmouth to define live workspace and think it is excellent. Eric Chinberg, Chinberg Builders. Now, my comment on that is Eric is not usually put off by extensive permitting processes, but many developers are, and I really think that if we could just define the path a little bit more clearly for them, that we would inspire.
First-time speakers? I'll now call second-time speakers that would like to speak. Third-time speakers? Seeing no one else rise, I'll now close the public hearing. Do you have any comments?
Just a couple of comments. Toward the live work unit, we did, I don't know if you are aware, it is included in our use table now. I'm not sure from your comments whether it was clear that it is on our use table. Being defined, I just noticed that it's not defined, so we'll work on that. But I did talk to the building inspector a couple days ago about this, and have looked at the IBC definition that we're including, so that will be coordinated with that. I'd made on a previous topic. Well, I'll get it later.
I just wanted to recognize we did receive 2 pieces of correspondence, one from Paul Manley, regarding the Borthwick Avenue and Islington Street project, and we did receive a letter from David Adams of 210 Gate Street. So we did receive those 2. I did want to acknowledge them. I would just like to go over one last time the final process. September 24th, we will meet as a board. The public is welcome, certainly, to come, although we won't take any public input. That's going to be our final review and comments on the draft zoning ordinance, and we're going to be implementing that and preparing it for a final draft to submit to the City Council. So that'll be on September 24th. And as a board item, our schedule for the next 6 weeks is pretty busy. Comments on the draft revised zoning ordinance. October 1st is a backup meeting if we need to complete the review on the 24th. October 8th would be the vote on the final draft to submit to council, and then October 15th will be our regular planning board meeting. So there are no other comments or questions. Do we have a motion for adjournment? Thank you. Good night.